Sweeney Talks To. This week I am joined by Richard Hewison. Now, he is trying to lead us back into the EU. When I say us, I mean the UK. He's part of the Rejoin the EU party. We hear a lot about parties maybe wanting to leave the UK. We've got the SNP. There's obviously a lot of Welsh independence. There was even last week, I think, part of the UK, one of the Scottish islands want to be part of Norway people. So there's a lot of people wanting to leave the UK, maybe break up. We see similar things across the EU. But you're actually, Richard, you want to bring the UK back in to the EU. So first of all, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so, you're sort of going against the grain. I think most people would maybe agree that Brexit's not been the success or even maybe delivered the things that people were expecting.
Yeah.
So, I guess that was a starting point for maybe the party sort of wanting to change things.
We are in an interesting position, Chris, because obviously all rational opinion polling at the moment is pointing to 60 to 67% of the population wanting to rejoin the EU. And indeed, it used to be just we did polls, was Brexit a mistake? And there was constantly a majority for Brexit being a mistake. But the supplementary question, would you want to rejoin the EU, was always polling lower. I haven't seen a poll recently where it's been less than 60% in favour of rejoining the EU. But we have this perverse situation in our politics where none of the major parties are advocating rejoining the EU. The Liberal Democrats, they have party policy to rejoin the EU, but their leader firmly says we're not a rejoin party, and therefore are very, very low in the opinion polls. So the majority of people want to rejoin the EU, but the majority of people are currently saying they're going to vote for parties that don't support rejoining the EU. We're arguing that those parties need to up their game a little bit and start actually facing the reality of the situation Britain's in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could sort of enlighten me some statistics. I mean, there must be a poll, I'm sure, of people that voted for Brexit that maybe now, how do they feel? And I think I read somewhere that over 50% regret that decision or would reverse that. Is that the case? I'm sure you've probably got more up-to-date numbers than I saw.
When we look at the detailed breakdowns, there's certainly a large percentage that do regret having voted. When we look at the figures, it seems to me roughly about 1 in 3 people who voted to leave would change their mind now, if we base it on most of the rational analysis we've seen. I've not actually seen any poll that's put that figure above 50, but I imagine it will end up that way eventually.
But I mean, if we were to take, say, even 30%, I mean, if you were to switch that, because it was 52% to leave, 48% to stay in the UK. So I mean, essentially, if we were to believe those polls, if we were to rerun the Brexit vote now, it would be to stay in the UK. It's to stay in the EU.
Yes. Because obviously only 2 out of every 52 people would need to change their mind to swing the polls the other way. I think it would be a far greater vote to rejoin if we were to have that. But this is the great shame, I think, Chris. We have lots of people saying, oh, we had a referendum, democracy, democracy, democracy. Yeah, one day in 2016, people felt that way. And the people who won that referendum know that they would never win a referendum again, which is why they persistently stopped any further referendums. Now, one of the policies the EU itself passed recently was a bit of a retrospective policy. I agree with you. It's called paragraph 30 of the EU decision in 2022, which basically says after any country leaves under the Article 50 process, then as a democratic safeguard, it may be appropriate for the country just to have a check and say, okay, this is the deal. Are you happy with it? Now, we didn't get that check. And that's why I would continue to argue we are now going down an anti-democratic route, not a democratic route.
Yeah, and I mean, I think maybe for just filling in anyone outside the UK or anyone in the UK maybe that's not today, it was February 2016. We had the vote to leave, but we didn't actually. The UK didn't actually leave until December 31st, 2020. So even in those 4 years, when I was in the UK for part of that time, I mean, things were quite different, I think, by the end of 2020 as when the vote was 2016. So it wasn't ideal, really, because it took so long to leave that by the time the UK left, it was a kind of different place in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most annoying things is we had a general election in December 19 where we basically said, right, Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. Then COVID came along. And I'm pretty sure even the most ardent Brexiter would have said, okay, we've got a global pandemic. Let's just pause, deal with COVID, and then come back and deal with Brexit. But because we had a fanatical government that just pressed ahead anyway, we've doubled the chaos that there is in the country as a result of that, when we could have had a much more rational debate about it. Now, I think one of the problems are, a lot of people say, oh, it's too late. Oh, what can we do? We know it's a problem. Well, if you think something's a problem, then change it. And that's why we stand in elections, to allow people to express that view.
Well, speaking about elections, you're obviously gearing up for a big one on July 20th, and we mentioned December 2019. Obviously, that was the election of Mr. Boris Johnson, who got Brexit done. I mean, whether you support him or well, I suppose whether you support him or dislike him, he was the one that led us out of the EU.
Challenge that a minute, Chris. I mean,
okay,
we still haven't actually dealt with the import checks that have to come in place to complete Brexit. That is still scheduled for October this year. And I bet you in July this year, this is being recorded, I bet you they're going to have to postpone that even further, because that will be another boost to inflation as we start putting checks on goods coming into Europe. Now, again, I'm not actually saying that to diss Rishi Sunak and his government. It's the logical thing to do. If you want to fight inflation, don't put inflationary forces in. So we still haven't seen the completion of Brexit, and already it's being partially reversed. We have the Northern Ireland deal, which now basically gives a free channel to all smugglers across the UK to just go through Ireland. And we're having to rejoin the Horizon programme because British science is just not getting the resources it needs outside the EU. So before even completing it, we're already starting to partially reverse it.
Well, I mean, I do think it's interesting you bring up Northern Ireland. We'll come back to Boris, because obviously, you're involved in this election, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But in terms of Northern Ireland, for anyone, again, it's maybe not in the UK, or people are not up to speed. Ireland's obviously split into two. The UK has control over the Northern Ireland, but there's a land border, a very small land border between Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. It can be militarized because of obviously past previous civil war and all that sort of stuff. But of course, there's then nothing to stop anyone getting a good driving across this unmanned border, and then you've switched from the EU to the non-EU situation. Now, where do we stand with things over there? Because even myself, and I try to keep up on this, it is quite confusing. What is it? So if you take goods from the Great Britain and you take them over to Northern Ireland, how do they prevent them leaving Northern Ireland into Ireland, which is then EU?
They don't. Right. And this is why I say it's a smuggler's charter. If you are a trader in London, yes, you can't go to Dover and take your goods that way. You can't put them on the Eurostar, but you can get in a little three-wheeler and go over to Northern Ireland by ferry and then go straight into the EU. Now, obviously, that does add costs, but it makes an absolute lie of this idea that there is somehow a segregation between us and the EU. There is a segregation in terms of freedom of movement being in there. It's not legal to actually do that, but there's now no checks to actually stop you. And this part of the Windsor framework, to me, is just crazy. I understand why the unionists in Northern Ireland get so exercised about it, because the unionists obviously supported Brexit at first, and now they're saying, well, hang on. Effectively, what this has done is it's basically meant that Northern Ireland, there's now an iron curtain between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. And I have to say, I have some sympathy with that. And still, the situation is really not resolved in a way I think people would be comfortable with.
Yeah, because I think one of the historical things is that people in Northern Ireland, some of them want to be British and do identify as British, not Irish. And then when you have this sort of two-tier system where they're sort of left out, then they feel less British, which you can understand. And of course, like I said, you can't put a militarized border or a hard border because of all previous things. So it's a bit of I think it's trying to square the circle. There is no one option. I think someone at one point, I think it was Boris, suggested having
sorry, Chris, but there is one option. There's the option we had before, where when we were part of the EU, you could be in Northern Ireland, you could feel Irish, you could feel British, you could feel European. All three identities were available to you, and it wasn't sophistry to say that all three of those identities prevailed. Since Brexit, that is now it's an impossible square to circle, a circle to square even, but we could, of course, rejoin the EU and take all of those problems away at a stroke.
No, sure, you're right. I was saying with the caveat of assuming we're not in the EU, but you know, it's difficult. I mean, I think as we mentioned, Boris again. I think at one point was he not suggesting a tunnel because then we would have almost like a channel tunnel, and we could have monitored a tunnel. I mean, I don't think that was ever a goal.
He was talking about building a bridge to the moon at one stage. I mean, the mad ideas that person came out with while he was in charge. It really is quite incredible. And obviously, of course, in Uxbridge, where we're fighting the by-election, there's a great big shadow over that by-election called Boris Johnson. And a lot of voters, I think, will finally get their chance to have their views on him expressed. And I don't think it's going to go well for the Conservatives in Uxbridge.
Well, I mean, you know, that's maybe the thing I was talking about. You know, sort of July 20th, there is this by-election, Uxbridge and South Ruislip. Boris Johnson, MP, has departed the scene. He left of his own accord. Mm-hmm. He's resigned. So obviously then they have to have a by-election, and you're running for your party to replace him. And how many people are running? Because I know in some of these by-elections, there's usually quite a few, isn't there?
17 in this one.
17, right.
Is quite a large number.
Right.
Although it does feel a bit like Groundhog Day, because 4 of the 17, including myself, formerly stood for the Mayor of London election last time. So it's like the old reprobates getting back together and inflicting themselves on the poor people of Uxbridge.
And can I ask you, you know, being from a smaller party, you know, you're obviously not getting the same mainstream attention and funding and donations. Yeah. Do you go in thinking you can win, or do you go in thinking I just want to make my point?
No, absolutely. That's a serious question, Chris. And so for me, it's all about the ethics of the situation. Now, I do not expect to be the member for Uxbridge next week, and the opinion polls confirm that at the moment, although it does look like we might get 7th or 6th place out of 17, which is pretty good for us on the running. But think about what would happen if I did win in Uxbridge. If I did win in Uxbridge, then it would be the UK clearly signalling that they're sick and tired of Brexit. They want to send a signal to the world that it's time for us to consider rejoining the EU. And as a result of that, I think the confidence in Britain and the international markets would start to recover. The pound would rise, pressure would come off inflation, and we would actually take a step to reduce mortgages. Now, I don't think I'm actually going to win in that by-election, but I'm giving the people of Uxbridge the choice to do that. So the people of Uxbridge do have in their hands, in their power, the power to reverse the direction we're in if they so choose to do so.
I mean, I think it's quite. I mean, it's quite a big deal because obviously Boris was, you know, he's obviously a globally known politician, and he was prime minister, but he also the one that sort of finalised Brexit, if we can maybe put the word finalised in quotation marks. But also, I mean, if you were to win, like you say, it's unlikely, but if you were to win, I mean that would be global news. I mean, that would be a massive thing, you know, because of who you're replacing and the signal you're sending.
And unfortunately, I think the media very much project to the people of Uxbridge that they have 2 choices. That's it. You've got 2 choices. Don't even think about making a protest. You've got 2 choices, Labour or Tory. What's your choice? And the other, you know, there are 15 other candidates there. There are 15 other ways that people can choose to express their democratic will if they so choose to do so. We all get fined personally £500 for standing. They call it the deposit, but let's be honest, it's a fine against democracy. It's to try and prevent other voices getting in.
But don't you get it back if you get so many votes, or you
5% of the vote, and that's not going to happen for many individual parties. So anyone who thinks that they're not going to get 5% of the vote is basically saying, we are going to charge you for standing in a way we're not going to charge the other candidates for putting themselves forward. Now, I know intellectually people think, oh, well, that's just to keep the number of candidates down and make it more reasonable and rational for people to do, but it doesn't stop it. We still have 17 candidates. So all you're doing is making those 15 people who won't reach the deposit level, and I'm pretty sure even the Lib Dems and the Greens probably won't reach the deposit level here. You are effectively just fining those parties for taking part in democracy, which is not a good look, I don't think.
Yeah, I understand your point. I mean, that's a valid issue. You know, so you're campaigning on 2 issues. You know, clearly, you know, rejoin the EU, which we'll mention is the name of the party, so that sort of goes without saying. And also, your second one was prosecute Boris. You know, you feel Boris has let the country down.
Yes, I do. And I think we have to look at the political system that we've got. And we have, unfortunately, established a political system where the very worst people in our society are able to get to the top, and they are able to lie with impunity to Parliament and to actually undermine the strength of our nation by doing so. And I don't think Boris Johnson is the only Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister who has lied to Parliament in the past. But the problem is they've all got away with it. And when you get people getting away with it, then other people will come along and do the same. So, yes, I do think Boris should be prosecuted because the lies on a bus that he promoted back in 2016 have caused untold damage to our economy, and he should be held to account for that. He shouldn't just be allowed to say, oh, well, I messed the country up. Let's go to my lovely career on the Daily Mail and make millions of pounds speaking. There need to be consequences. And if that makes previous prime ministers consider their own position as well, then quite rightly so.
I mean, I agree with you on the sort of if someone's lying, they should be a sort of thing. And I've got to say, I'm not a conservative. Far from it. I do not vote Tory. But I think there's also a thing is where someone can make a prediction or sort of say they want to do something, and it can't happen. I think it'd be hard for you to say to a politician, well, everything you say has got to happen. I mean, we've not all got a crystal ball.
This is an interesting point you raise, Chris, because back in 2016, Boris Johnson might have been able to say, oh, well, I'm not prime minister. I'm just leading the campaign. All I'm saying is a prime minister of goodwill could spend 350 million a week on the NHS. But he then became prime minister and didn't enact the very pledge that he'd made back in 2016 that caused so much problems. Now, that to me is a lie, and it's a demonstrable lie if you become prime minister of the country and are in a position to actually deliver. Now, in fairness to Boris Johnson, I don't think he ever thought he was going to win referendum in 2016, which is why he said that. But the problem was he said it. If you make a pledge in an election, you have to follow through. Otherwise, you undermine trust in democracy.
But then do you not feel like maybe things like COVID or, we've had the awful invasion of Ukraine, but, by Russia, these things can impact where something you said, maybe cannot happen because of a third party reason that, and life's always like that.
I totally concede that, Chris. But go back to February 2020 or even January 2020. We're in a position where we could say, look, there's this looming international crisis coming, so let's just delay Brexit until we've dealt with it. Now, Boris Johnson actively chose not to do that. He chose to persist with Brexit to the letter by December the 31st, 2020. He is therefore totally accountable for what happened there. He was totally in a position to predict what COVID was going to do. And by December 2020, the EU had made it very, very clear that they would delay the Brexit process if necessary. Johnson's government persisted nonetheless. So for that reason, I can't have sympathy in saying, oh, well, it's COVID. You knew that as the government. You chose to persist in those circumstances nonetheless.
So you're talking more about sort of policy things as opposed to, we've had a lot of the Partygate. And again, if anyone's not following British politics, Boris Johnson had, or his administration had parties in Downing Street when, COVID, we all had to be maybe, two families, or you can only see so many people, and they wantonly broke those rules, hence why he got a fine from the police. I think our current Prime Minister, Richard Sunak, also got a fine, and there's pictures of people dancing, and he even talks about London Mayor. I think someone who'd have ran for London Mayor had to leave London Mayor, Sean Bailey, if I'm not mistaken, had to step out of the race because
very far, has he? He's still on the London Assembly, and he's now potentially a member of the House of Lords. So
there was a video last week of people sort of dancing around his I don't know if it's his office, but an office doing his campaign. And again, there was even a poster on the wall saying "Mind your." What was it? Social distancing was the phrase we're all using at the time. Social distancing, and these people are sort of almost dancing. Well, they were dancing around, and grabbing each other, and things like that. So, what I was going to say was, that's not so much your focus. It's more serious policy as opposed to getting into these small, and not small things, but, personal, back and forth and who said what. You're thinking more substantial policies.
It is very much, but it has provided useful evidence because Boris Johnson's made a career out of lying, in my view. Now, I can say that now because Partygate meant Parliament declared him a liar in their report a few weeks ago. That's why we have this election now, because he's been outed as a liar. Rather than face the justice of his own constituents, he chose to resign knowing he would have been thrown out of office. But once Parliament decides that a particular individual is a liar and has evidence in one circumstance, then I think we can review everything they've said in the past, which may be false. And certainly for me, it's the substantive issues over Brexit, which are the big falsities that Boris Johnson should be held accountable for.
And sorry to maybe sort of hammer home on this and sort of drive you potty with it, but I think what you're saying about Brexit is that they were aware that the benefits were not going to be realised and they still carried on with Brexit. You're saying that they knew, right, we're not going to be able to actually achieve some of this stuff, but we're still going to plough on because it suits our political needs to be out of the EU.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say to politicians in general is, don't make pledges in elections, even if you don't think you're going to be elected, that you then can't do. And as strongly as I condemn Boris Johnson for what he did during the referendum, I would equally condemn, for example, Nick Clegg with signing his pledge on tuition fees in the 2010 election. And then when faced with office saying, oh, yeah, I didn't really mean it. If you sign a pledge, if you make a public pledge during an election campaign, you have to follow through or admit that you can't when you're actually elected.
Yeah, and I mean, I keep referencing stuff for people outside Britain, but again, if anyone doesn't know who Nick Clegg is, he was a leader of the Lib Dems. They got into power with the Conservatives. He said he would not. I think he would never charge students. What was it? He would never charge students tuition fees, but then they went against that, and now he seems to have got a very good job at. Was he at Facebook? Yeah. He's one of the senior people at Facebook, isn't he? Or Meta? Yeah, sorry, the company Meta.
Yes. So in terms of being in charge of spreading true information with his track record, it's interesting that Meta recruited him there. But to make a serious point, in that election in 2010, Nick Clegg broke through in terms of the promises he made, but he was basically talking to a whole generation of 18 to 25-year-olds who that affected. Now, that generation of 18 to 25-year-olds, they're now 30 to 37-year-olds, and they have been taught deep cynicism in British politics because they believed and trusted that politician at a time. And Nick Clegg, oh, well, let's go off to my job at Meta, not a good work.
I mean, another thing I wanted to ask you about was, I mean, I've been talk to myself, not for a number of years, but I've got a rough idea of what I know what it looks like. I've been up there a few times. Now, I'm always wondering, in these sort of by-elections, when you go up against someone who's been a very powerful politician, and clearly you can't be any more powerful than the PM, are they able to sort of do things for their local area that would ingratiate themselves that maybe a lesser, and I say that with respect, someone without any power, maybe a sort of backbench MP is not able to do, so you're fighting a losing battle. Do they get extra because their MP is the PM?
I think you actually get a bit less, to be quite honest, because if you are PM, you can pretty much do what you like. And it's quite clear, talking to most of the people at Uxbridge, they've never seen Boris Johnson in their life. He certainly didn't go around the streets campaigning or canvassing. But of course, when you're Prime Minister, you set the policy. It's often the little backbench MPs who want to rebel against you, whose constituencies are given something nice to keep them on board. Now, to me, that is corruption. I don't see why one area should benefit from national policy when another doesn't, simply because you're trying to grease up the local backbench MP. But no, I don't think there's an inbuilt advantage to having the Prime Minister as your particular MP. If anything, quite the reverse.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And in terms of the mood on the street to Boris, what are you encountering? Because as you mentioned, you've got a little bit of sunburn today from your campaigning efforts. So, what are you hearing about Boris Johnson on the doorstep?
The interesting thing I would say is, yes, there is a lot of antipathy towards Boris Johnson. He is not a very popular MP by many, although he does have quite a few passionate supporters there. And our leaflet has a little image of Boris in an orange jumpsuit behind bars staring out. And that has certainly caused a few people to come up and challenge me in the street over that. So there's been some robust exchanges. The odd thing I would say is Boris Johnson is not the most hated politician in Uxbridge from the conversations I've had. Indeed, I wonder if you might guess who you think might be the most hated politician based on the conversations we've had. Who would you pick?
That is a tough one. I don't know. I mean, the most hated politician, is it Richie Sunak for taking over from Boris Johnson?
And it's not Keir Starmer. It is far and away Sadiq Khan, which actually quite surprised me.
The Mayor of London. Right.
Indeed, the Mayor of London, mainly because of the ULEZ scheme, which has obviously been quite controversial and divisive. The sad thing is, of course, this particular election is the one election where nothing can happen on that. So electing someone to Parliament won't impact the London Assembly and its attitude towards ULEZ. But it does seem to be far and away the biggest issue that, in terms of personality politics, that people have raised with me. And of course, there's now quite an interesting split between the Labour candidate and the Labour mayor on that, which is...
So does that make it quite a difficult election to run and campaign? And if the biggest issue is not actually... I mean, although the Mayor of London is connected to the government, it's not it's two separate departments almost. Does that make it quite a tricky one to run in campaigning?
It kind of does. If we believe what the opinion polls say, and there was a nice opinion poll out that spoke to 500 residents in Uxbridge to see what their issues are, and ULEZ is the second biggest issue after the cost of living. Obviously, for us, the single market and the cost of living is the main thing that we want to focus on, and how we can try and improve that by getting back our trade with Europe and reducing the trade barriers. Our position on ULEZ is quite, well, I say quite clear. Our position on ULEZ is very much that we do need to do something about the atmospheric pollution in London. We need to try and make it a safe place for people to live and work and breathe. But we think the way it's been rolled out without any consultation and hitting the poorest in our society has been very, very poor. And our view on it, if we were fighting the London mayor election, which, let's be honest, we will be doing after the next few weeks, then we will be advocating that we have a citizens' assembly where we actually step back as a city and have a look at the evidence and decide where we want to go on ULEZ. But for this election in Uxbridge, yes, it's a big issue, but of course it's utterly irrelevant which candidate's elected on that basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of it's a slightly unusual situation to be in, isn't it? From that point of view. And in terms of sort of mainstream attention, I mean, I had to ask you before this call when the actual by-election was. I mean, I could have looked it up. I was just sort of getting my notes together and things like that. I mean, I knew it was happening in the next few weeks, but I haven't seen a huge amount. And I do consume a fair amount of media. I've got to be honest. How I came across your party was I was reading The Guardian. I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, and someone was talking about how someone had written a letter in saying all political parties are trying to break things up, and I mentioned the SNP, the Welsh Independents, and we've got various factions in the EU, and someone wrote back saying actually there's a party trying to put the jigsaw back together, and they're called the Rejoin the EU party, and that's how
The Guardian originally then that they replied to. Right.
Yeah, that's how I heard about you. Now I'm not. I don't know if I don't know how many people found you that way. But I like to say, I've not seen you on other platforms, and maybe you have been on. I've just missed you. But what's the kind of interaction do you feel? Do you feel being this Rejoin EU party sort of puts you at a disadvantage? People don't want to hear it.
It's not so much that people don't want to hear it. It's if you look at what we've done in elections in the past. The Mayor of London, we stood in several by-elections now. We can relatively consistently take 6th place when we put up a challenge in an election. So you've got the big two parties, usually Labour and Conservative. You've then got the Greens and Lib Dems occupying the next two slots. You've then got the whatever extreme right-wing party there is, Reform, Reclaim, whatever, and there's us. So consistently we can grab that place. But that's not interesting for the media. The reason why Lawrence Fox, for example, has got so much more publicity in Uxbridge than we have is because he started burning flags. Now, yeah, if we wanted to get attention, we could start burning flags, but that's not really the sort of people that we want to attract to our party. And I think it's very sad to say that mainstream political debate does not really want to talk about other policies outside what the big parties are offering. Now, I would say that as we have demonstrated that we can get into the low single digits percentages when we stand in elections, we should get the low single digits percentages of coverage in the main media as well. I'd be quite happy if we got 1% of what the other parties get in the mainstream media, but we just don't.
Yeah, I mean, I do find that, from a media point of view, and obviously that's my background, my profession, I do find it slightly odd that the fact that you're going up against, or you're replacing the person who was the architect of Brexit in terms of being launching the campaign, then being the Prime Minister, being such a well-known figure, I do find it slightly odd that there's not more attention or more of a platform given to you. Like BBC Question Time, these things, have they approached you, or have you? Is it just no? Is it just
indeed? No. One of our party members, our media manager, has constantly railed against BBC's Question Time about this, and constantly bombards them with, well, why aren't you inviting us on here? I mean, particularly where we had the Brexit only edition the other week. I mean, that really was. I won't say a disgrace, but I think it should be balanced by a Remainers only. If you're going to do an episode just for Brexit supporters, then you should do an episode just for those who were. Remember, it was 52-48. It's not a tiny fringe of the economy we're talking here.
Yeah, because I mean, I think you also get sort of, people commenting, and obviously we mentioned Lawrence Fox, who's really well known as an actor. I mean, he was a very well known actor. Was on TV and things like that. I think he still does some acting, to be fair. But people like him
on the streets in Uxbridge, I've seen. certainly I can't believe much of that's genuine. But anyway.
Tell me about the flags. I mean, I saw. I got to say, I didn't. I don't pay too much attention to Lawrence Fox when I'm aware of him and I do watch some of his stuff. But what was the flag burning? Was it EU flags? What was he burning?
During Pride Month when he took the LGBT flags and burnt them in his back garden.
I see. I remember that. Yeah.
And then puts out a message saying how supportive he is of the LGBT community. An image is worth much more than words, and people know what you're saying when you burn the LGBT flag. You are burning people's identities, and that's a very clear message he sent across. Personally, I'm not a flag person. I don't believe in waving flags around. I find it a little bit strange, but a lot of people's personal identities are tied up in flags. And when you start burning flags, you are starting to burn people's identities. And to me, that is an expression of hate.
And you mentioned that the far right parties usually beat you guys. So I usually nip in there ahead of you.
Well, perhaps I shouldn't say far right, but perhaps I should say strong right, because there's strong right and there's openly fascist parties that start. The openly fascist parties, fortunately, are still doing very, very poorly. But the solid right parties, shall we say, such as Reform, Reclaim, they tend to do better. But of course, they've got loads of money because they can spend lots of money, and they have lots of people like Lawrence Fox, people like Nigel Farage, well-known faces, will stand for those parties. And of course, once again, if you put in an injection of celebrity, you will get publicity. That's always going to be the way.
Yeah, and I think one thing we've seen not just in the UK but around the world is maybe an explosion of maybe the last 5-10 years of centre right or right wing media. It's becoming a lot more popular. I think if you ask people, they can name sort of right wing platforms. I'm not saying they're all hateful speech and racist, but some are. But majority are not that. But they are right wing platforms. We can all name them. Most of the British newspapers are definitely leaning to the right, and that's fine. That's their decision. But why don't parties like yourself get the same engagement in terms of finance or celebrity backing or people coming out? Because there must be, like you say, at least 50%, if not maybe more. But there's a lot of people in that world that would back you. Why does the left or the progressive or the whatever term you want to give it, why don't you get the same engagement?
Because I think we're back to the same one more heave attitude that we were in the mid-90s, where even with Labour at 51 in the opinion polls and the Tories at 25, people are like, no, we can't do anything to disrupt this. And I think what a lot of people fail to realise is if you genuinely are in a situation where Labour are polling 51 and the Tories 25, once you've got a position where the leading party is more than double the second party, tactical voting becomes irrelevant. You can actually vote for what you believe for. Now, obviously, we're potentially 18 months away from a general election, so the polls may narrow at the moment. But from where the polls are now, there's absolutely no rationale to this. But I do get the opinion that even a lot of people that I have quite a lot of respect for are saying, I don't know if I can bring myself to support anything other than Labour. Yes, Keir Starmer, nothing he says resonates with me. In fact, I oppose everything he does, but I have a feeling that he might change his mind once he's elected. And really, we're in a society where you vote for someone because you think they might do something different from what they're saying in their manifesto. It's a bit of a sad state to be in, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, is there an argument that maybe well-known people, actors, celebrities, sports stars, TV presenters that do feel they would like maybe to rejoin the EU, don't want to speak out, don't want to maybe pledge their colours to you, is because they're going to get a backlash, whereas people that maybe are on the right, some of them seem to, I don't want to say enjoy this, but they seem to quite like getting into these kind of Twitter, social media kind of dialogues, and they're very active on that. And Lawrence Fox is someone who is very active on that kind of platforms, and Nigel Farage as well. They seem to kind of not enjoy it, but they seem to kind of like getting into that. Do you think people just don't want the hassle? Like they think if I do say I'm rejoin, or I do want to speak out on, or I do pledge money, I'm going to get a backlash. So I'm just going to stay clear of my own business.
Yes, there's definitely a certain amount of nervousness. And I know from talking to people who quietly support us, but who don't want to have an active engagement, there's all sorts of reasons people give for that. For example, we had one supporter in London who was very, very keen to support us, but said, I'm sorry, I can't be involved myself because I've got a foreign surname. And someone else said, well, my partner's from a European country. What might happen if it gets known that I'm supporting you? I mean, they didn't quite use those words, but that's basically what they were saying. And I think one of the really sad things is that there is a very, very dark shadow, of course, from the assassination of Joe Cox just before the referendum. That's obviously it was a terrible tragedy for the family, but it has put a lot of fear into people about being openly pro-EU. And indeed, a lot of, as I say, once again, a lot of people will message us with support, but a lot of people are quite nervous about getting involved. And that, unfortunately, is just a fact of the society we're in now.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real shame that. I mean, obviously that was a total tragedy. I mean, we can't underline how big a tragedy that was. I mean, poor women, just horrific. But the fact that that's not had a chilling effect for other people, it really does sort of, I don't want to say question our democracy. I don't want to get into that territory, but it does. It's a real concern that people can't maybe just state their political views as they wish.
And also, I would just add, I mean, I'm quite critical of the Labour Party and many of the front bench spokespeople on the EU, but I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of them were friends of Joe Cox and were genuinely traumatized by what happened there. And I'm not sure if they ever got proper counselling as a result of that. But to see one of your colleagues executed basically in that style, it has to cause fear for yourself in terms of the way you conduct your business. And so, I think we need to be genuinely sympathetic there.
And what's your social media like, in terms of abuse or support? Do you state, is it quite good, or do you notice when you put certain things out, you get a certain reaction, or what's it like?
To be honest with you, Chris, even if I try doing tweets that are a little bit on the edge, I think, right, okay, let's just push it here. Let's see if we can stir people. I very, very rarely get a terribly negative reaction. Perhaps my Twitter in particular is a bit of an echo chamber. I do notice sometimes when I support other people's tweets, then a lot of abuse comes in. To me, it's
what sort of tweets are they? What sort of issues would you notice a sort of a spike in negativity?
The National Rejoin March people, they're a very, very good active group of rejoiners, and they've got another march coming up in September. And I notice anytime I retweet them or put out a tweet supporting them, then I get the usual crowd come back with some pretty negative remarks. There's also I noticed certain former politicians as well. I shan't name them, but one very good candidate for Mayor of London prior to when I stood, I often tweet out her tweets supporting her, and then I get a lot of abuse there. So it does seem that there's a lot of individuals that are specifically targeted, but I'm not one of them.
Yeah, it just seems there's a louder voice against the left, more progressive, again, whatever term you want to give it, than there's on the right. I mean, I think Diane Abbott, obviously she's a Labour politician. I don't know if it's still the case, but I think she was the one that got the most social media insults or whatever you want to call it, and they totaled it up, and she was getting the most, and it always seems to be going the other way. And I just curious why that is from a politician like yourself, if you understand it, because it just seems that one side's got a louder voice than another, and I don't really quite understand why. It's kind of interesting,
It is. And obviously, I'm mainly engaged with Twitter myself, but other people in the Rejoin EU party who have someone responsible for Instagram, someone responsible for Facebook, they all engage on different ways. I think my colleague on Facebook manages to generate quite a lot of controversy and negative messages, often in my name. And all I can say to anyone who's insulted me on Facebook, hello, I never see the message, but, go for it and knock yourself out.
Absolutely. And maybe you can also a general question, sort of campaigning. What does that look like in 2023? Are you've talked about, obviously, you've got the sunburn, so you are out hitting the streets. Is that the way they do it? Is social media, just talking to an echo chamber that people follow you? So if you want to actually connect with people, you've actually got to go out there, chat at the door and speak to them.
It's interesting. I've found we tried doing both in Uxbridge at first, door knocking and speaking to people on the streets. One thing I found in Uxbridge, and I stood in the Chester by-election back in December as well, and I also found this as well, that when I was door knocking, I found three emotions, basically. Number one, very positive towards us, but concerned about splitting the vote. Maybe they'd vote for us, maybe they wouldn't. Number two, very negative towards us because obviously they didn't want to rejoin. Although we had some very interesting and polite conversations with Brexiters on the doorstep. They're nothing like as awful as many of the Brexiters that you see in social media. But the third group, probably the dominant group, and to me, the saddest group, is people who've just accepted they have no control, no influence, are totally apathetic, and basically just see politics as something that's done to them, that they have no real say or stake in. And that group, I think, is increasing, the number of people who just feel they have absolutely no power, absolutely no impact there, which is a shame. In Uxbridge, probably when we did the door knocking, we found a similar ratio. But we tend to find the street campaigning is much more, because obviously, if I'm standing on the street shouting, Brexit's a disaster, vote rejoin EU, the people who stop to engage are the people who are either really interested in what we've got to say or really want to tell us how wonderful Boris was.
Yeah, and in terms of businesses, because they're like maybe a pretty good litmus test of Brexit. Local businesses in Uxbridge, are you finding a trend one way or the other there with what they would like?
They're very nice when we speak to them, local businesses. One thing we've done different in Uxbridge to what we did in Chester. In Chester, we were actually asking local businesses about their views on Brexit, and again, had a lot of local businesses say some very, very strong things, but not want to do it on the record. In Uxbridge, we've been more of a, hello, can we put our leaflets on your counter, which every business has been very, very helpful and supportive with. We might, in the final week of the campaign, see if any local businesses are willing to go on film and talk to us about their experiences of Brexit. But quite often we sort of talk to business people who are very, very angry and will talk to us and say, Ray, would you like to be on our video and talk about this? And they say, yeah, I'll be on your video. And then when you go back, they've thought about it and they're thinking, actually, I don't really want to put my head above the parapet. I know what might happen to people who are pro-EU. So there's certainly a lot of reluctance there, I think.
And does that make it sort of doubly frustrating for yourself that maybe like something like the BBC, they're supposed to be sort of, impartial, objective, offer everyone a sort of voice, that they maybe won't engage with you because if you have people that are supporting you are worried about speaking out because of the backlash, and you can't compel private newspaper groups or platforms to speak, whereas the BBC's got a kind of charter where they're supposed to be. Does that make it doubly frustrating that the BBC's not giving you that platform?
I'm not sure frustrating is the word.
Disappointing?
I think the BBC are failing in their duty, and I don't necessarily say they have to have us on talking about rejoining all the time, but they are failing to balance the argument, of course. There was one very amusing thing on the Breakfast News a few months ago where they were interviewing a lady who was talking about the problems they are having with delivery. And you could see she knew she was being naughty. And she turned around and said, of course, no one's going to say Brexit on the BBC, are they? And that made me smile a bit. I think we have to remember the BBC have taken, in my view, a very poor decision in saying, right, Brexit's done, we're not going to discuss it or re-engage. And that has meant that a lot of the problems of Brexit, even though they'll have people on talking about problems that are clearly related to Brexit, actually having the debate is something the BBC seem very reluctant to do.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I think obviously part of it was we have had the vote in 2016, we did leave in 2020, so we had 4 years of, I guess, limbo. No one's quite sure. And anytime I leave the UK, if someone realises in the UK, they usually might ask you about Brexit and where are you on that and what's happened. And again, you're kind of thinking, well, where are we on it? It is a kind of difficult thing to sort of pin down and say, well, it's done, it's not done. By the way, Ireland, and again, I think I've mentioned a few of the caveats. Ireland's not a simple situation to explain. There's all those different caveats of, people's identities, past troubles, etc., etc. So it is quite. I wonder if what you guys are doing, if people have got the stomach for it, does that worry you? Because I feel like you're trying to push a car up the hill, it just won't go up the hill.
Not at all, Chris. My responsibility, as I see it, is to open up the option to people to solve the problem that we've got with Brexit if they choose to do so. It's not my role to force people to do it. Now, I will go so far as to go out on the street and explain why I'm standing and explain to people why I think their vote would be useful to me. To vote. But at the end of the day, if I'm not elected, that's not my responsibility. That is Britain's responsibility to do something about it. Now, I would like to see the major parties start living up to their responsibilities on this. In fairness, I think the Greens and the Lib Dems have both moved since we started our party in a positive direction on rejoining. I'm not going to say that's due to us, but I know the Green Party now have reasonably positive policy, and the Lib Dems kind of in this odd limbo. The party says one thing, the leader says another thing there. But if we can kick upwards to those two parties, then hopefully eventually the Greens and the Lib Dems will kick upwards to the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and we'll finally get some sense on this issue.
So, I mean, is that your goal, almost to be an alter ego of Nigel Farage, shall we say? Because Nigel Farage obviously was someone who, he campaigned for a long time, but he was never actually elected in Britain. I think people maybe are surprised about that. He was elected as a member of the European Parliament, but he's never actually been elected in Britain, although he has run in several elections. But he is kind of seen as almost as the kind of godfather of Brexit. I know Boris sort of took it through the door, but he's seen as the one that drove it. And if you may ask most people, Brexit, I think they do associate Nigel Farage with it. Are you hoping to sort of be almost an alter ego of that, where you maybe not the person that carries the ball over the line, but you've kind of started the momentum and you keep it going?
No, I don't think so. I'd rather like to be like one of the nameless individuals before Nigel Farage, who just basically set up a structure so that and I don't want to talk about it being a Nigel Farage. I would hate to think that whoever we attracted would be a Nigel Farage. I mean, when we set up the Rejoin EU party, I was leader for the first period of the Rejoin EU party. I've now recently handed over to our new leader, who is a former Conservative MEP, who I think gives the party a little bit more gravitas and will take us that next stage. And I'm hoping that when he comes to the end of his term in office, we'll hand over to an even bigger name. Maybe we will get a Nigel Farage later on, but I don't think anyone's going to be attracted to the role of leader if we say we want you to be our Nigel Farage. I think that would...
I meant more just that sort of figure that they sort of pushed it through, but maybe they're not actually directly, because I think it's one of these things the conversation has to keep bubbling away. And it is tough to do that for the number of reasons we've talked about already, it is tough. My final thing before I go, obviously I think everyone's got to ask all people standing in by-elections or elections, why should the people of Uxbridge and South Ruislip vote for you? What is your...
That's a very good question. And what I would say to you is I am the only candidate who, if elected in Uxbridge and Ruislip, would actually make a difference to your life. And you might say, well, surely not. But if you elect the Labour candidate, which I'm pretty sure the polls say they're going to do, it will have zero impact on our society. We'll have another Labour backbencher. Keir Starmer will do a lap of triumph for a while, but that will be it. If you elect a Tory, you're voting for the status quo. But if Uxbridge was to elect a Rejoin EU party candidate, that would signal to the whole world that Britain's starting to come to its senses over what's happened. It would mean immediately we would start recovering credibility with the rest of the world in the financial markets. We would see an immediate reaction in terms of the pound starting to lift in value, and that would have an immediate impact on the cost of the food coming in from abroad. So quite frankly, out of all the 17 candidates, me being elected in Uxbridge is the only one that will make a tangible material difference to the quality of people's life in Uxbridge.
Brilliant. Richard Hewison, thank you so much for your time. You're from the Rejoin EU party. I wish you all the best, and thank you again for speaking to me.
Marvellous. Thank you, Chris.